can we educate people in how to assess and use different sources of news? You made the point, it really is your civic duty to, in my mind, not spread falsehoods and do your due diligence. But do you teach that in any of your classes, or is Cooley Law School addressing that in any way?
Well, I do teach the ethics course. I think it's, we have
Can everybody hear her okay?
We have a responsibility not just to be passive consumers of information. So now we have to check it out. We have to check out the source, who wrote it, has it been vetted, where is the evidence? That's what we're trained to do as lawyers, to look at the evidence and not just somebody's word about it. That's what we have to do. We have to look at the evidence, check out the sources, vet it.
You know, it's really interesting. A journalism group did a study on what is trusted more by social media users. And what they found out, that people who consume news through social media, they trust the sharer more than the producer of the content. So if my good friend Megan Holland consistently puts up interesting news on Facebook and it seems to be true, I trust Megan and don't even pay any attention to who's actually producing it. It might be madpatriot.com, or it may be dailycause.com. Those are kind of right and left websites that sometimes I think stretch the truth a little bit. And so, but they don't even look at who produced the story. They just know, oh, Megan put that up there, so it must be true. And that, as a journalist, is very depressing. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's Facebook feeds have changed a little bit during and after the election, and there seems to be kind of an unwillingness of some people to check the facts. I encourage you, before you share any piece of news, to check 3 things. One is the source of the news, where that came from. 2 is make sure that if you're sharing it as a factual piece, it is a factual piece and it isn't an opinion column. I see a lot of people sharing opinions that they think are straight news. And the 3rd one is to check the date, which is maybe a lesser known one to do. But you know, I see people share news all the time. I mean, MLive sees traffic spikes for people resharing news that's old news. You know, I give the example of, I think 2 years ago at one point there was a bad snowstorm and the state shut down and state employees didn't have to come in, and I had written a story about that, you know, several years prior, and then I think last year people started resharing it again. There was a bad snowstorm and people were like, oh, we don't have to go to work today. Like, no, you have to go to work. Those were last year. So I would encourage you to check those 3 things before you share responsibly, if you will.
We've seen people die a few times over the course of the years too, where somebody died again.
Oh, yeah. It was Sonny Elliott late recently, the old Detroit weathercast. Oh, Sonny Elliott died. Yeah, I did, like 4 years ago. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen some amazing research in brain science, and we may be a little lower the angels, but we're not that much higher than slugs. And we are basically still animals. And a lot of what we see, how people think, how they react, who they trust, is related to our animal instincts. You know, mice hang out with mice, and squirrels hang out with squirrels, and rats hang out with rats. They're all rodents, but you know, they're just within that family. They're just not getting together. And that is something that affects us as humans as well. And so it is not at all surprising. It may be disheartening, but it is not at all surprising that if you trust the person who has told you something, whatever it is, then you're going to believe that person over perhaps a large corporation that would tell you the same thing. I mean, every one of us, I'm sure, if you go around each of these tables, has some family legend that they just believed inherently until somebody said, well, let's check that out, and discover that, oh no, that's not true. I mean, there was a friend of ours who talked about how when they cooked a ham, they always had to cut it in half and cook it. Somebody finally said, why did you do that? And I said, well, it's because my mother cooked it that way. And so that's how you cook a ham.
I just want you to know that when my mother baked brownies, she cooled the four corners. That's what it was called, was cooling the corners. And it was a key factor in making sure the brownies were prepared properly.
Well, I mean, and this just went on until they finally got to great-great-grandma, who started the habit of cutting the ham in half and cooking it, and figured there was some great science behind this. Why did you cut the ham in half? Because I didn't have pans big enough to cook the whole ham. So, and it just went on and on and on. Well, that's an innocent sort of example of what happens, and why we need to think about how we behave instinctually and how we should behave intellectually.
You know, in my research on fake news, I almost feel there's more discussion in Europe about how to stop it than there is in the U.S. Britain has, they actually set up a task force to look into it. They were very concerned. In Germany, with elections looming there and concerns about Russian interference, they saw what happened in the U.S. They talked of fining Facebook for any fake news. And in Italy, Italian officials proposed that EU countries should deal with, quote, post-truth politics by establishing antitrust-like agencies devoted to finding and removing fake news. Have I missed it? Are there conversations like that going on in the U.S. by our government? I don't know.
Not that I've heard. I mean, on a certain level, it sounds, you know, I've heard some people propose as a theory, not anything happening in reality, but that there should be some sort of verification system, or like, you know, a tiny check mark by a share that proves that some organization had vetted it and found that it was truthful news. You know, some of that could be helpful, but on the other hand, I guess just as a member of the free press, I feel like there's a fine line between that and maybe some censorship, or getting left off a list because someone doesn't like you or your politics. And then where do you draw that line with opinion as well? If you write an opinion piece that everyone doesn't agree with, that doesn't mean it's fake necessarily.
And it certainly doesn't stop someone from tweeting. How do you go against that?
And those nations don't have the kind of constitutional protection for free speech and free press that we do. They just don't. And of course the courts have given very, very wide, and properly so, given very, very wide swath to the ability to speak and print freely. One of the things that is to act as a check is the fact that you try to verify and you try to prove what it is that you say is true. And we have existed, for the most part, fairly well on that system, even with the problems that we have encountered historically. This is another issue that we're going through, and at some point we figure it out, you know, and then we'll just go on to the next crisis. But I can't imagine that there would be any serious attempt to try to do that in this country. And frankly, if there was, much as I hate fake news, I'd oppose it, just for that very reason. If you're going to be free, you have to be free, even to be wrong, even to lie. Much as it distresses me, you have to have that freedom.
You know, Emily, you pointed out you're against it because a legitimate news source may be left off the list because perhaps the administration doesn't like them very much. It's actually, I think it's happening a little bit right now. The International Journal Review is the only news organization granted access to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on his trip to Russia. It's emerged as a favorite news outlet for the Trump administration. However, they were linked to, their publisher put up a story suggesting a link between Obama's trip to Hawaii and a judge's ruling there on Trump's revised immigration order. Everybody knows the judge out of Hawaii was the one who cracked down on the latest immigration order. So there's some selectivity going on already in this weird atmosphere that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's kind of expected. I covered the campaign here in Michigan. I covered the primary and then was one of two people covering the general election for MLive. I work for the largest news organization in the state, and I was denied access by the Trump campaign on one or two occasions, and my colleague that was co-covering was with me on more occasions. And I think that they selectively were picking who they let in Michigan, so I don't see why they wouldn't do that nationally. It's unfortunate. On the other hand, I wonder if in the long run it's to their advantage or not. For instance, I covered an event in Detroit that I couldn't get into that Trump was speaking at. I was outside with the protesters the whole time telling me how much they hated Trump, and I was in the middle of Detroit where it was very hard to find a Trump supporter. My story did not look great for the Trump administration. So I think that it was, or at that time campaign, I'm sorry, but I kind of question long term whether that lack of access or trying to control access to that extent is really beneficial to governing.
In politics, politicians have always had favorite reporters, and I mean, by and large, politicians don't like reporters. Big deal. I mean, it's not like we're going to go home and weep bitter tears in our pillow because somebody doesn't like us. At the same time, they can't live without us. Now, technology has changed that to a certain degree. I mean, the IJR is a joke. Western Journalism Review is another one, is a joke. But they're very popular among the right wing. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this continue. I mean, Richard Nixon certainly didn't like a lot of reporters. Every president has reporters they like and reporters they don't. They dislike more of them than they like reporters. So I think Emily is absolutely correct. This goes only so far until people start saying, wait a minute, what about this? And we have very quickly started to see a wait a minute, what about this mood hit the country. And it'll be very interesting to see what comes of that. But you want to stick one reporter on the plane, okay, fine. There's another plane behind it that's got all the rest of the reporters. And the stories will still get out. It might take a little longer.
The latest form of possibly fake news is happening on Twitter, and I confess I jumped in feet first when, in the wake of President Trump's election, these rogue Twitter accounts started up. The rogue POTUS staff Twitter account and the alt, you name it, department, alt DOJ, alt NOAA, alt this, alt that. And I started following all of them, wondering, are these really alternative accounts out of all the federal departments? Is the rogue POTUS staff person really in the White House? And, the tweets were fun and interesting. And even Mark Cuban of Shark Tank tweeted out, I have reason to believe that, White House staffer is actually inside the White House. And after reading a lot of the tweets, I have reason to believe maybe they aren't. But it's really been a confusing phenomenon on Twitter. Any thoughts on that? All three of you, if you want to answer. And you have to be obviously a pretty hardcore Twitter user to be interested in this.
Yeah, I would say that, you saw Twitter pretty early on try to create their own verification system, right? So if you're a famous person on Twitter, if I'm Halle Berry, I don't know, is that a contemporary example? But you get a little check mark by your name, they verify that it's really you, so that, Emily Lawler isn't posing as Halle Berry and tweeting out things that she wouldn't want associated with her image. I have a check mark to prove that I'm a real reporter, I guess. But it's kind of interesting that they have done that to some extent to try to legitimize certain sources and certain people you can trust that are actually representing themselves on the issue. But yeah, as far as the rogue accounts, I mean, every time they would shut one of those down, I assume another one would pop up, right? So, I think they have taken steps to try to legitimize Twitter as a news source.